The last few weeks, we've been talking about requirements under the Americans with Disabilities Act for your practice and how you need to structure your practice, who the act applies to, and what some of the requirements are. One of the things that we really need to talk about are when you have someone with a disability who comes into your office, and what do you have to do in order to provide auxiliary aids for that patient? Now, we've got to remember that as physicians, our primarily responsibility is really to make sure that we have good communication with that patient. We want to make sure that the patient is being able to communicate with us, what they're feeling, their symptoms, and the reasons why they're there. Additionally, we want to make sure that the patient fully understands exactly what's going on in the treatment protocols that you're recommending and what the diagnosis is. It's when that communication breaks down that a lot of times we begin to have some health disparities and health challenges with our patients. And so, we have to remember that although this is a legal requirement, that also as physicians, this is something that really should be heeded, for the best interest of the patient and the best interest of the patient and your best interest as a physician. And so we're going to talk about what are those requirements, what are those auxiliary aids that you have to provide in your practice for the patients, because really what we're finding is a lot of doctors really don't know and they don't have a plan. 9/10 of this process is having a plan and knowing exactly what is required and what you should do for the patients and on the patient's behalf. So, first of all, it's again, as I mentioned, it's really centered around effective communication. And if you have someone that comes in that has hearing impairments or is deaf or has visual impairments or is blind or whatever the case is, what services, how are you going to make sure that your communication is clear? And what guidance are you going to give the patient, someone who is blind? Make sure that you appropriately are guiding them through your office. And you can't expect the patients, and this is really, really important. In these cases, the law actually specifically indicates that the responsibility is on the physician's practice to aid these patients and to provide these auxiliary aids to the patients. It's not the patient's responsibility to bring people with them. In fact, sometimes really that's not even a good idea. You don't want to recommend that. Now, if a patient, says, "Hey, I'll go ahead and bring somebody with me to take care of this," that's a different story. And sometimes they want to bring somebody with them, and the financial responsibility could fall on you as well. That's a discussion to have with your patients, but I'll touch a little bit more on that in a few minutes. But the key is really effective communication as well as appropriate aids for guiding around the office if necessary and things along those lines. But communicate with the patient to find out exactly what they need, and to be clear with it so that there's no breakdown in that communication. Now, what type of aid is needed? Well, it could be any number of different things that are required, and we're going to go through some of that. So, again, as I mentioned, it's not acceptable. In fact, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, this responsibility can't fall on the patient. The responsibility is actually to you and your practice on what you do in order to provide these aids, but it has to be acceptable to the patient. That's key. You can't just say, "This is what we do, deal with it." Instead, this becomes a part of the conversation with the patient to make sure that you're providing the appropriate level of service to that particular patient. Incidentally, one of the things that we get all the time is, "Well, how do I know?" Well, this is where it is a patient responsibility. The patient does have a responsibility to inform you and give you reasonable notice. Now, that's really, really important. In fact, what the law even indicates is that when it's possible, that you should even allow for walk-ins. But you can have a policy that allows for a reasonable notification in advance so that you can prepare and have the appropriate interpretation services in your office to help them in the communication side of things. And you should have the appropriate staffing or know exactly what to do. Again, this all falls back to having a plan on how to deal with patients who have needs for auxiliary aids. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, as I mentioned before, maybe you have a visually impaired or a blind patient that may need additional assistance in guiding around the office, and guiding to the tables or to chairs, and because they're going to be unfamiliar with their surroundings. And again, you can't require them to bring someone with them. So you've got to be prepared to be able to handle that in your office. Other examples, maybe you have somebody who is, again, either deaf, hard of hearing, or maybe has speech impairments. What does that look like? What are some of the services that could look like? Well, in these cases, you most likely are going to be required to have a qualified sign language interpreter. You could have a note taker, computer-aided transcription services, written materials, maybe telephone handset amplifiers, assisted listening services, and many, many other things. Or, the computer that with a large enough print that they can read, and your forms may also have to be in large print for them to be able to read if they're visually impaired. So then for your visually impaired people, then of course, qualified readers, tape, text, audio recordings, brailled materials possibly, as well as large print materials and assistance in locating items. And this is what I mentioned before, and finding their way to the appropriate exam rooms and guiding. Talk to the patient in this regard and say, I'd like to guide you back to the room. How would you recommend to do that? We want to make sure that you're comfortable with in this circumstance. They'll give you and coach you through that. Work with the patient. Again, you're a team in this respect. And so that's going to be very, very important. Now, some of you may be sitting back and going, oh man, you got to be kidding me. I've got to come up with an interpreter. Well, we're going to talk about some interpretation requirements in your office and in a future week that's unrelated to the Americans with Disabilities Act. But in regards to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and when we're talking about those with disabilities, you still have to provide interpretation services such as American Sign Language when appropriate, and when that is the type of communication that the patient wants. And like I said, you're probably sitting there going, well, how in the world do I do this? Well, we live in the 20th century, and this is a beautiful thing because we have a lot of apps and services that are available that you can actually set up in advance and be a part of your plan to help these patients and help further the communication between you and the patient in this process. So there are companies like, say, Genie, and this is not an endorsement. I make very clear you want to do all of your own research as well. But Genie is an example where you can actually sign up for a service online, and at that stage, provide with an ASL interpreter through, say, a tablet or a laptop to help that patient that needs that communication assistance in your office. And so there are ways to do it that are affordable. Now, when I say affordable, some of you are going, well, this could be cost prohibitive. In fact, it could cost me more to do the interpretation services than what I'm actually going to be reimbursed. Well, that's how it's written. Actually, that is a requirement, and that cost can't be a factor. In other words, yes, if the interpretation services are a greater amount than what you're reimbursed for the services that you're actually providing, that is an expense that you're going to have to take on in your office. That's the way that this particular act is written, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that cost is on you as the practice, and it's your responsibility. It can't have anything to do with what you're going to be reimbursed for that particular service, nor can you pass on that expense to that patient. It is your responsibility and your expense that you're going to have to absorb. Now, are there cases where financial hardship could be taken into consideration? And really the answer is yes, but extremely limited circumstances. In fact, based on the pricing that's out there and what you can do for online interpretation services, quite candidly, very, very, very few of our doctors would fit into that exception rule, because again, it's not on a visit by visit basis, but instead it's going to be on an overall financial picture situation where it would be just debilitating and crippling for your office to offer these services, and so that's going to be tough to get around. Now, the other side of this is, we talk next week, we're going to talk about enforcement as a whole on a lot of these issues. But at the end of the day, yeah, you're going to have to do it. Yes, the cost is yours. And you also have to make sure that you work with the patient on exactly the services they need. There's a case actually down in Georgia where a medical group had a patient come in and basically they refused to do ASL, American Sign Language. Instead, they just transferred notes back and forth, and the patient walked away and really had no clue what was going on, didn't understand the diagnosis, wasn't able to effectively communicate the symptoms and challenges. And ultimately, the courts actually sided with the patient, which many, many, many times they do in these cases, especially if there's a disagreement between the patient and the physician, and sided with the patient, and it cost the practice $400,000. It was $200,000 in actual damages and $200,000 in punitive damages. There's other cases where there was actually out of West Virginia a small medical group who was fined $5,000 because they didn't provide the appropriate services to their patients who had visual impairments and also required ASL. And so these are things to be aware of. Again, we don't do it because of the penalties, right? We're doing it to make sure that we have good communication with our patients. But at the same time, if you need additional influence and reasons to go ahead and implement and step forward and set up a plan, write it down, make sure your staff is trained and knows exactly what would happen. Because we do get these calls where somebody will call and in a panic and say, hey, I got a call. I've got somebody coming in this afternoon. What do I do? And we have to walk them through all of this. And so it's better for you to have that plan in place now and your staff fully trained so you can take the appropriate steps and help your patients and communicate better. Next week, we're going to talk about the enforcement and what that looks like across all of these different realms. And then in a few weeks, we're going to talk about some other interpretation services that are required in your office. But hopefully that helps you out. We'll catch you next week.